The following was recorded during the COVID-19 pandemic through Zoom meetings in accordance with local health guidelines.
So for me, the call to faith was kind of gradual. I actually have a more significant time that I knew that I was called to ministry, and then later the kind of ministry that I was called to. And so that's the basic testimony.
Hi, welcome back to the Ministry Misfits podcast. This is episode number 4. I'm your host, Andrew Fouts. With me again today is Dr. Greg Linville, our executive producer. And today we want to talk a little bit about, why this podcast exists. Again, we're kind of doing this out of order from a traditional route. Typically, this would be our pilot episode, and then we would talk about some of the different things with it in episodes 2 and 3. But we went ahead and released an interview first, and then a second half of that interview a second time. And then we started with our principles and our strategies, and now we're talking about what's actually going on. So hopefully you can follow along with my misfit mind of a brain. But Dr. Linville, welcome back.
Great to be here, Andrew. Thank you.
So those of you, if you haven't already listened to the first few episodes, you can go back and do it. We're on all the major platforms, as well as you can watch the video portion of this on Facebook and YouTube. There should be links on the Facebook page, as well as on our Twitter account at Ministry Misfit. You can also find us on Overwhelming Victory Radio. If you go to overwhelmingvictory.org and click on the radio tab, we are listed on the podcast list there. Speaking of Overwhelming Victory Radio, this is something that you and I kind of came up with in the midst of COVID. Last year, we looked at the amount of resources that Overwhelming Victory, which is the research branch of CSRM, we looked at the resources we had and realized we have an opportunity to be able to be strategically relevant to the newer generation of ministers that are coming up, that are more inclined to be listening to stuff while driving or in their office through podcasts. And so we started putting together a plan to get like-minded podcasters and podcasts together in one central place where the sports minister or the senior pastor interested in sports ministry, whoever it is that's coming to Overwhelming Victory, they're able to find a library of sorts of podcast resources that deal with different things, whether it's directly how to do your sports ministry, whether it's how to do sports ministry in a mentorship role with Dwight and Angela McDowell, whether it's hunting ministry with Jamie Balcom, all of these different things. And so we created this little library and we launched it in January of this year. But then we also realized we needed to expand even our own outreach within podcasting, and specifically one that deals more with the minister that kind of feels out of place. Typically this is a sports minister mindset of where we kind of don't know where we fit in to the church model because, we're wearing gym shorts and everybody else is in business attire. John Longworth, in one of our episodes with him, talked about how part of the reason he survived so long is because he was kind of annexed off in his own office. And so he wasn't even always feeling like he was a part of the staff, even early on. This sort of thing is a very common thing, and it's becoming more and more common where ministers are starting to tell us that they don't necessarily feel like they fit that church mold, church model that everybody expects somebody that says, oh yeah, I'm a pastor, for them to be in what they look like or talk like and all of that. And so we decided to go ahead and just jump right into these kind of discussions here in a podcast form. So Greg, give us a little bit of insight. What all is it that Overwhelming Victory is about? What is it that we're doing? How does this all kind of fit together?
Well, as we've talked about the last couple sessions here on Ministry Misfits, we've talked about theological truth driving what we do. I'm going to give you a biblically based concept here, and that is you've got Barnabas who goes and rescues Paul. Remember, the disciples didn't want anything to do with Paul. He's up there, and for a number of years, we have nothing that would verify that Paul was successful in ministry at all. No churches that were started, no individuals that he's writing letters to that he seemed to win to Christ. It's only when Barnabas goes and grabs him and then begins to mentor him does Paul begin to flourish in ministry. And suddenly churches are planted, individuals are coming to Christ, and the New Testament, much of it is written by Paul through the inspiration of the Holy Spirit to those people. Okay. Then they take off they're commissioned by the church in Antioch, and they're to go out in mission. And they go. And they have a guy by the name of John Mark with them. And they do really well when they're on this island. Think about island, whatever. It's usually a pleasant thought. Out in the Mediterranean. And Barnabas is pretty well respected there because that's where he had his agricultural business, etc. And now they take off across the Mediterranean. They land on what's now modern Turkey. And John Mark bails out on them. Just bails out. Now, people might say, well, he was a failure because he didn't fit that mold. But Barnabas, in the same way that he knew that Paul didn't fit a mold until the right mold was then envisioned, he also recognized there was great reason to think that Mark would be a great minister of the gospel. But he wasn't that missionary to climb those thousands of feet from the Mediterranean up to where they had to go, up to all those people and all those places. But he had another ability. He had another calling. And so Barnabas said, Mark, let's go do this. He wrote the Gospel of Peter. It's called Mark, the Gospel of Mark. But he basically, after Barnabas passed John Mark on to Peter, he wrote for Peter. He may have helped even in writing of the letters of Peter. And even Paul then, later on in his life, said, I have great need of Mark. He recognized that he didn't fit maybe that missionary mold, but he fit the mold that God had prepared him for. And I think going back then to what you were saying, that's the biblical theological foundation for Ministry Misfits, that people are not always called to a pulpit ministry. They're not always called to a preaching, teaching ministry. They may not even be great with people. They may not be good at ministering, but they are still called to ministry. And so we find this a lot within sports rec and fitness, that a person who says, you know, if it wouldn't be for this, I'd probably be leading a fitness in a storefront someplace where I would just have people come in and do Pilates or do whatever. But boy, the church gave me an opportunity to do what I'm gifted at and passionate about and still be able to reach people for Jesus. So that Ministry Misfit, that's what we're hoping people will begin to flourish in. They'll find their John Mark role, not to be the missionary, but be the person who wrote the gospel. Or in this case, much like what you're doing, not that you're a misfit necessarily, but you are so gifted at this technological side of things and you're empowering ministry. It is a ministry that God is empowering you to do. Let's grab all those ministry misfits in the world and let's put them in their place and empower them.
So 2 Timothy 4:5 is the verse that, I kind of used when using the theological framework that we do, of the idea of, Paul telling Timothy to preach the message, whether it's consistent, to stick to it. But the final thing he says is to endure hardship and fulfill your ministry. And that is really where we want to kind of sit within this podcast, is how do we actually fulfill our ministry, especially when we have people telling us that it's not necessarily a ministry, or things that this is outside of the ministry's reach, that we should not be, you're just the sports minister, you just deal with the sports stuff, leave the politics to us. You're just the youth guy, you leave the theology to the big boys. All of those sort of things, these kind of concepts that unfortunately have kind of weaved their way into certain areas of the church. We want to be able to come alongside and, like you said, gather up all of us ministry misfits and be able to say, what is it that God has called you to do? How is God equipping you to do it? Maybe he's using us here at Overwhelming Victory. All we do is resourcing within Overwhelming Victory. Maybe it may be that we have the resources you've been looking for to finally be able to move into the realm of actually modeling your ministry and not just being stuck in the theological philosophical phase. These are the type of things that we want to do. So we're going to take a quick break, and then we will get right back to talking about what you can expect from all of this, and where we're kind of going with all of it. This episode of the Ministry Misfits podcast and this awesome shirt are brought to you by a Courageous Clothing Company. Courageous Clothing Company is a Christian family-owned business that specializes in custom designs that they create, as well as bulk screen printing of your custom designs as well. When you buy from Courageous Clothing Company, you're not just buying an awesome shirt, you also are helping spread the gospel across the world through the missions that they support, such as this here with Ministry Misfits, as well as with their own designs that have Christian-themed messages, sharing the gospel in an awesome and relevant way, or as we say within CSRM and Ministry Misfits, strategically relevant evangelism. Check out their entire line at courageousclothingcompany.com. So welcome back. We're here with Dr. Linville. This is our 5th episode where we're kind of just breaking down what Ministry Misfits is, what it's all about. We kind of laid out the theological framework with the idea of discipleship and, using the evangelical friends term, tapping somebody on the shoulder and say, hey, I see this in you. We're going to record this down. Paul's words to Timothy of, enduring and fulfilling the ministry that you've been called to. But this is something that is not necessarily just like we've been talking about, this isn't necessarily the traditional type of thing that you see coming out of Overwhelming Victory necessarily, because a lot of what we do has to do much more with the ministry and how we actually, how do we run our sports ministry? How do we do this? But this is not something that is completely foreign to what we do. And a lot of what, the work of CSRM started out as was actually going more directly to the minister and saying, how can we help you? Is that accurate, Greg?
Absolutely. When CSRM started, whenever that was, 25, 30 years ago, it kind of depends on what you call the start. Best we knew, there was about 200, 250 what was called usually recreation directors at a local church. Now that was in the 1960s, 70s, that was happening. Now we know that there's thousands upon thousands of them, but still many of them are not really fully equipped to be able to do what they need to do. And it was very much a focus on the individual sports minister at first because they were getting beat up. They didn't get any support. People didn't understand what they were doing. And so there was a huge focus early on supporting those people. Now, as it's become more accepted, now we're still helping that minister, but we're helping that minister create the ministry that the church needs to take on and the congregations of the church. So one of the things that I think is important for us to understand in this ministry misfit concept that we're working on is that we we really embrace what you had just said and really affirm that people have these different callings and that God is going to use them to grow the congregation, which then grows the church. And we want them to be affirmed, to know that this is a high calling on an equal par with any other calling. And we want them to be encouraged when they get discouraged because of various things. The soccer mom who's in your office yelling at you, or the baseball dad that's on the field yelling at you, or the elder who doesn't quite get it, or the minister who is the facilities person, and that's a ministry. That's why I say it like that. Is so frustrated because they got all this cleanup to do after your big festival. That discouragement that comes from 3 weeks in a row having your league rained out, and what you got to do to reschedule. Those are the frustrations that we're trying to help people wrestle with and trying to figure out how to do it. Now, when it comes to the Overwhelming Victory Radio, which are these different podcasts, let's take our good friend Jamie Balcom and Cowtown Adventures. This guy knows how to fish and hunt and, the thin fur feather stuff. But what I really like about it is that he knows how to barbecue what he's out there catching. And now we could just do a whole thing that's out there about how do you hunt. But our niche is, how do you help a church, a local congregation of the church, how do we help that congregation envision, goes back to level 1, tier 1, theological truth. How do they think and envision a ministry that helps hunters or anglers? And then how do we organize that? And then what do we actually go do? How do we do that? Let's take the McDowells. And these folks are some of the most wonderful people that have in their own marriage, and then helping other people in marriage, and also helping people just in ministry to mentor them. Now, they could do a whole lot of things. They are doing a whole lot of things. But their particular niche in Overwhelming Victory Radio is tying together that sports minister who comes home late because the fields had to be mowed and he got rained out in the morning and couldn't get on the tractor to go mow the fields and had to come home a little late. Or the gal who suddenly had a leak in the roof over the aerobics class and had to get new, so that now that person is all frustrated and it doesn't go well in the marriage that night. So Dwight and Angela are helping those specific areas of life that tie the sports minister to the marriage, or any of these things that we're doing out there. We've got to figure out how can we connect that to the local church sports minister, fitness instructor, and all these things are important. We know that in marriage there's general things, communication, how to deal with finance, how to raise kids, all those things. And so maybe not every specific minute is going to be on a local church sports thing, but it's going to be definitely with that person in mind. And that's what makes this OVR, this Overwhelming Victory Radio, specific and focused on who our target audience is. It's not going to be to the general minister, except in some general ways. It is going to be that for the sports minister. It's going to be very specific to the sports rec and fitness minister. That's why I'm excited about it.
And that's a good segue into, how we want to kind of finish out this episode. What to expect from this one, because we are very much and unapologetically very much directing a lot of our resourcing into sports ministers, especially because unfortunately we know that they're ones that get plagued with these kind of things a lot more often. But like you said, it doesn't necessarily mean that if you're not in sports ministry, you're not going to be able to gather anything out of these sort of things. we've already talked a bit in the previous episode about the 3-tier paradigm. We're going to talk theology on here. We've got, a couple guests already lined up. Dr. Linville will be on here a lot, I'm sure, if nothing else, because he's the executive producer, and so I can say it's his job. We're going to talk theology, but we're not going to be talking theology that is going to be, over your head out there. It's going to be out. What does the Bible actually say about some of these issues? We did this with Bradley Barnes here at the beginning of what does the Bible actually say about racial reconciliation? We're going to be talking with our upcoming executive director, Dan Stauffer, about, what does the Bible actually have to do with planting? What does Scripture tell us about discipleship and church planting? We've even got, I've been talking with a guy that wants to come on and talk about, even he wants to share from his point of view, but this is important for us to talk about. We have a former PK, pastor's kid, that wants to talk about his journey of how being a pastor's kid, he still had to find God on, learn who God is for himself and learn theology on his own. We've got these other resources coming in that hopefully will be able to allow you to be able to think through some of these things through the 3-tier paradigm, as far as how are you being strategically relevant to your church and community? How are you being efficiently effective to your community and to your church, whether that's in a ministry setting, whether that's in the gym, whether that's just being a volunteer. Hopefully out of this you'll find that you actually kind of like this sports ministry thing and you had no idea you would, and so now you're going to go out and volunteer to coach a team. There's a lot of things that can come out of this, but we want to be able to talk to you on your level, on a way that you can understand. We want you to ask us questions. We want to be able to talk with you about what makes a minister of the gospel, and specifically then after we talk about that, how can we use sports to do it? Even in these areas where it doesn't look like the traditional route.
That's right. And let me just speak to a couple of points there, Andrew, because why are we doing it in this specific mode? Well, we're not only doing it in this specific mode. That means a podcast kind of a focus or presentation, if you will. We're doing it in we're writing the books.
Mm-hmm.
We're doing these podcasts. We're doing the Tuesday talks that are conversations once a month on these topics. And it's like we're sitting at a cafe and we're talking and we're having some of these conversations that who knows where they lead. They're very organic. We're doing it through certification, providing certification for people. We're doing it in all kinds of ways, but we recognize that more and more that the upcoming generations are using more digital than the hard copy where they sit down and read a book. But once they get engaged in it, we find that they then enjoy going back to the book and putting it all together. And so we're trying to be holistic, and that's why we're taking this approach. And there's one other thing I'd like to say along this line, and that is that maybe today what you and I are talking about is not going to be relevant to a particular person. I'm thinking about, in some ways, that there are many people out there that have been doing the sports and rec stuff for 2, 3, maybe 4 decades, and this seems really juvenile, or this seems really, I did that 20 years ago. And yet for somebody who's just starting out, this may seem like it's 20 years beyond them. And yet, even the person who's been doing it for 20 or 30 years, we believe that there's going to be some little nugget that's the answer to this long nagging thing. And for all of the conferences we've had, we had like 30 years worth of conferences. And I've gone back and listened to every single recording of every single one that we ever recorded, of every seminar, of every plenary. And people say, why do you do that? You've written the books on it. And it's because I learned something every single time. So I'm challenging the 20, 30-year-old vet to come back and get this, because fundamentals you need to go back to every now and then. And yet I'm also asking them to add to the equation. And like you said, ask us questions, but also say, hey, that was good, but you missed this, that, and the other thing. And let's get those guys on and let's talk about it.
Oh yeah.
And those that have the questions that yeah, we want that so we know where to go. We want to scratch the itches that are out there. So that gives you a little bit of an idea of why we want this type of venue, because it is beyond the normal, just a book. It's all encompassing.
And even, going into what you were just talking about, as far as even these 20-year veterans, things like that, the reality is that most of you that are 20-year veterans at some point probably had this question come into your head of, am I a misfit for all of this? Is this where I'm supposed to be? All of us go through those different kind of stages within our ministries. And so it's helpful for those people that are either getting started or that are stuck in a rut right now to be able to hear stories from you that have already worked your way through it and are now, we talk, John Longworth just is, 20 years, Danny Downing, 20 years at their churches. How do we get past this idea of nobody's listening to me? They look at me like I'm the young kid that's just out there rolling balls in the gym and babysitting. How do we get past that? How, what are these theological truths that we can grasp? What is the method of moving past just this basic understanding? How do we do it? How do we find people? How do we find the Greg Linvilles in our life that are going to be able to train us and develop us and lead us forward? These are the kind of things we want. These are the conversations we want to have. These are the conversations that are going to benefit everybody and especially benefit the kingdom overall. If you have a story you would like to be a guest, contact us. You can contact us at Ministry Misfit media@gmail.com. You can contact us on Facebook at Ministry Misfits. You can contact us on Twitter. It's at Ministry Misfit, because that Ministry Misfits was already taken for some reason. We want to hear from you. If you're the up and coming minister, if you're a minister that's stuck, we want to hear from you as well. Let us know what it is that you're struggling with, what you want to hear about. As we were saying here, I just got an email. There's a group of worship pastors coming from different denominations and backgrounds that want to come on and talk about, what does this fourfold rubric look like in terms of, the music that we choose for Sunday morning? Sports ministers, the music ministry may seem to be out. I am not musical at all. This is why I stick to microphones and running sound. I'm not musical at all, but the sports ministry and the people that I'm able to impact and bring in have a large part to do with the style of worship to be strategically relevant to the community. These are the conversations, this intergenerational, interministerial type relationships that we want to promote, that we want to build, and that we want to continue to develop. So again, if you want more information about CSRM and how we can help you in this area through consultations, you can contact us. If you go to csrm.org, you can click on the consultation setting there. You can get a hold of us on Facebook as well. CSRM has a Facebook page. Overwhelming Victory has a Facebook page. There's a lot of ways you can get in touch with us, but we want to be able to have these conversations with you, whether it's on a recorded microphone like this, or whether it's in person or over email. So I believe we are out of time for this one. Dr. Linville, thanks for coming on for the past few. I'm sure you'll be back. And we hope the rest of you will, like Dr. Linville said, tune in, be able to grasp something out of what we're talking about. Let us know what you're thinking so far, things that we could do better, things that we could do worse, or, different topics, things like that. So stay in touch. We'll be back next week. The Ministry Misfits podcast is a production of Overwhelming Victory Flicks, Overwhelming Victory Radio, and Ministry Misfit Media. Dr. Greg Linville and Andrew Fouts are our executive producers. Our theme music is entitled Rain and provided by Morning Light Music. For more information about Overwhelming Victory, visit overwhelmingvictory.org. For more information on CSRM, visit csrm.org. If you are interested in listening to our sister podcast on the Overwhelming Victory Radio Network, visit overwhelmingvictory.org/OV Radio. If you're interested in contacting Ministry Misfit Media or have your own story to share, you can follow us on Facebook and Twitter at Ministry Misfit or email us at ministrymisfitmedia@gmail.com.